Hello, and welcome to the Mr. 50mm YouTube channel. Today we're going to be having a discussion about living life at 2x, specifically at 2x crop factor. Some of you may have noticed that despite having reviewed a lot of full-frame cameras, medium format cameras, and generally chunky censored cameras, that I have a bit of a soft spot for Micro Four Thirds. So this might not come as a surprise to anyone, but it's going to be a bit of a biased opinion of the general Micro Four Thirds camera system. After all, I do have a kind of disproportionate amount of Micro Four Thirds cameras and 4/3 cameras for that matter. And I tend to even choose Micro Four Thirds / 4/3 size sensors for my DIY projects, like this one right here. Anyways, I'm really making this video because I've seen quite a couple videos out recently that are more focused on sensor size comparisons and whatever. So I decided, for what it's worth, I'm going to toss in my 2 cents, except not really, because this is going to be a general video about the Micro Four Thirds system as a whole and not just about sensor size, because there's already been quite a bit of discussion about that at length. And to be clear, I'm not trying to tell anyone how to choose your gear or why my opinion is best opinion. I'm just going to share my personal experiences and thoughts on the Micro Four Thirds system and why I enjoy using it. So with that, let's get into it. An insane used market. The Micro Four Thirds camera system has existed since about 2009, making it the oldest mirrorless series of cameras if you don't count Leica. And despite what Mr. Conspiracy says, OM System and Panasonic still have some life in Micro Four Thirds land, as anemic as they may be. That OM System tech rat, it's doing its best to get some tech. Anyways, back to my actual video. This means that the pool of used stock in Micro Four Thirds equipment is actually quite nice, and prices are pretty reasonable, save for a couple very specific models like the Pan F or the GM5. Bodies can be had for as little as 75 USD, like this one here. It's the EPL2. And for me, the most expensive Micro Four Thirds camera that I have to date, I think, is either going to be the Panasonic GH4 or the Olympus EM1 Mark II here. And even lenses for this camera are a pretty good price. Yes, of course, there's going to be quite expensive, chunky pro lenses that are big and heavy and not cheap. But if you're looking for cheap and cheerful, there are actually quite a large amount of first-party options. For example, the Panasonic 14mm f2.5. It's one of my favorites, and I typically see it for around $125 used USD. There's also third-party lenses from the likes of Sigma or Chinese companies like Yongnuo. And I think that this is a pretty important point that it's an important point that can't be stated enough. That the Micro Four Thirds system itself has a lot of very nice, very high quality, very small, and importantly, pretty budget-friendly lenses. Again, think one of these, the 45mm f1.8. And that's something that's always drawn me into the system. I don't think I've had really a single bad lens from this series. I think possibly maybe the worst one that I've experienced is the original 17mm Olympus Pancake that launched with the EPL1 And really, the only thing that wasn't great about that was the slightly pokey focus. But otherwise, images from that are pretty great. Variety. Again, this is something that partially stems from the system's longevity. And while modern day Micro Four Thirds, the scene is a bit stagnant. I mean, what new Micro Four Thirds cameras really come out from OM System or Panasonic? Anyways, never mind that. Look at the entire lineup, not just the new stuff. And you can get the sense that there's a big category of cameras. If you ignore the current set of pretty samey looking cameras, save the OM3, you can probably pick and choose a camera layout that you want and just kind of roll with it. For example, let's say you want something ultra compact. Okay, how about the Olympus EPM2 and pair that with the 14mm f2.5 Pancake? Want an EVF? Sure. Purchase the optional hot shoe mounted VF4 and slide it on top of that. Don't want the EVF to be removable? Okay, let's swap that with maybe a GH2, or hey, if you like that flat top design, how about the GX85? Do you want your EVF to tilt? GX8. Do you want a traditional DSLR looking mirrorless camera? Here's the EM1 Mark II, or G7, G9. There's just a ridiculous amount of options. How about, do you want a vintage look but on a budget? Have a look at the Olympus EM5, any of them. The Mark 1, Mark 3, Mark 2, the EM10, lots of options. And this is just the bodies. The lens selection is also very well-rounded. Again, as with the used market selection, the overall selection is quite massive, from super duper tiny pancakes to massive telephotos, first party, third party, adapted lenses, whatever. I don't think there's a single system out there that has as much selection from body styles and for lenses, aside from maybe E-mount, but that's more or less the lenses. When it comes down to body configuration, it's not quite the same league. The original 4/3 dream realized. For those of you who remember, one of the pitches for the original 4/3 DSLR system was that with a smaller sensor from the get-go and lenses designed from the ground up to be part of a digital system, the dream was that the system could deliver on good image quality, but could also deliver on smaller, lighter lenses and thus a smaller, lighter setup, because they didn't have to make lenses that covered a full 35mm full frame image circle. Well, in the DSLR age, that didn't quite pan out. There were a couple very lightweight lenses for sure. And the problem is there were plenty more lenses that were about the same or as big as their APS-C size competitors. However, once the mirror was dropped from 4/3 and they got to adding the word micro to the 4/3, I think the dream became a reality, where the 4/3 system had the 25mm pancake to demonstrate the compact nature that could be. The 4/3 system, the Micro 4/3 system has an entire suite of pancakes. Not only that, if you look at the standard focal lengths that you could get on the Olympus/Panasonic Micro 4/3 systems, these lenses tend to be smaller and lighter, and in some cases cheaper than their full frame or APS-C equivalents. And a lot of times the prices are on par, but sometimes, as I said, you do find cheaper. And with the right pairing of camera body and lens, you can get a complete system that weighs very little and can be borderline pocketable, all while still having interchangeable lenses. Pretty awesome. Another side benefit from this is that a lot of Micro Four Thirds lenses focus absolutely at bonkers speeds, thanks to in part the fact that their elements are smaller and lighter, so they don't need to shift as much weight, and then they don't need to invent a new type of motor to do it. And lastly, while I do tend to prefer bigger Micro Four Thirds bodies with EVFs and a lot of command dials, the fact is, when combined with a nice compact lens, the entire package can still feel very compact and very light, while also retaining excellent ergonomics, like this EM1 Mark II. As much as I like my A7 series cameras, they quickly become very chunky when you have to get full frame optics in front of there. Here is my 85mm 1.8 on A7 II, and here is the EM1 Mark II with a 90mm equivalent 45mm f1.8. That is a pretty big difference in chunky glass. Now, I understand that some of this, well, most of this is just the fact that with a larger frame, you are going to have to get more glass in there. But part of this is also the fact that with modern optics, there's always the chase for sharpness and correcting aberrations and whatnot, and the result of that is going to be bigger, heavier lenses. But still, with these compact lenses on Micro Four Thirds, it overall ends up resulting in, again, the original dream coming true. And this is something that personally I'm liking more and more, since nowadays on a lot of the photo walks that I go on, I have to wear a bibby, or at the least roll one. And while yes, I may sometimes prefer to have a chunky full frame camera, sometimes if I'm wearing a sack of potatoes on my chest and it's kicking me in the tum-tum, I just want to carry a lighter camera system and still take pictures. The crop. This is the big important thing. Shooting all sorts of sensor formats, sensor sizes across digital and non-digital mediums, maybe as a YouTube talking head, I'm just less inclined to care about sensor size. No, I don't think that's true at all. I think really what changed was the fact that the Micro Four Thirds system is a mirrorless system, and I do think generally that has allowed things to kind of level out the shooting experience across sensor sizes. Let me explain. Back in the days of DSLRs, sensor format definitely played a bigger role when factoring in shooting experience via the optical finder. And this is because with a smaller sensor, you didn't have to have as much prism/glass works to make the viewfinder transmit light to your eyeballs into a smaller sensor anyways. And it just happened that with bigger sensor cameras, they had to use other bigger optics to move the light from the center plane to your eyeball. And it's not to say that the OVF on 4/3 cameras were bad or anything, but you could definitely tell that they were a little more tunnely. And that wasn't always the case. For example, if you look at the Olympus E1, the OVF in that camera is pretty great, and it's fairly big given its sensor size. And you probably wouldn't be able to tell immediately that was a 4/3 camera, unless you had another camera directly beside you to compare it, like a 1DS. Then you'd definitely see the difference. But move into the mirrorless era with EVFs, and I think things were made more equal. Now, it didn't really matter how big your sensor was. You could have an EVF be as big as you want, and it wouldn't really impact the size of the camera, where an OVF with extra magnification would negatively impact camera size. The fact is, the OMD EM1 that I have its EVF looks about the same size as the one on the A7 Mark II. And I actually, as a result of this, don't really notice the sensor size difference as much when I'm shooting. And that's, I think for me, probably the biggest impact to the operation of these cameras. Especially being that I really love viewfinders, whether or not optical or electronic. And while I can't say that I hate composing using the rear LCD, my preference is almost always to use a finder at eye level. That said, this might have been a force of habit that formed from the DSLR times that I'm just not willing to let go of. So I really do think that the use of EVFs across mirrorless systems has, as I said, leveled out the playing field. Picking up a Micro Four Thirds camera, looking through its EVF, and going through the range of APS-C, full frame, and even medium format cameras, if you're just looking through the EVF, the experience is going to be pretty similar across all of them, since, as I said, making a big EVF is a much less of a challenge than making magnification on an OVF for a smaller sensor, making it look like a bigger one. I know Pentax is doing its own thing, and they make their APS-C OVFs look gigantic, but they're more the exception to the trend. And again, I think this is important because when you're actively shooting with that OVF or EVF, I should say, you don't notice the sensor size as much as a result of the chunky EVF. Yes, you might notice that the bokeh isn't as smooth or isn't as blurry, but when you're framing and shooting, I think the mirrorless concept itself, the EVF, is doing a lot of the heavy lifting there to provide you that good experience, irrespective of that sensor that is taking the photo. Yes, I can sit here and talk about focal length equivalence and try to have a look at aperture or depth equivalence, but in reality, unless I'm specifically trying to make a video about that specific topic, I'm probably just going to grab my Micro Four Thirds camera, pick a lens that's close to the focal length that I would like to shoot in full frame equivalent, and go up and shoot. And when I'm shooting, I'll frame up using the EVF to see what the sensor sees, and if that view feels too tight, I'll move back. If I can't move back, I'll try to reframe and see if there's another angle that looks good. And if that doesn't work, I'll think whether or not this shot is worth switching lenses or whether or not it's worth taking at all. I don't normally think that I need more blur in the background or that the bokeh isn't smooth enough. But maybe that's just me. That's all I got for this video. Let me know what your thoughts are on the Micro Four Thirds system. And is Mr. Conspiracies right? Is it dying a slow death? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe a super thanks if you're into that. Till next time, bye!